Dawn came slowly over Negro's Island, washing the volcanic ridges in pale blue light as 4P-38 lightnings swept in low, engines humming in tight synchrony. Major Thomas B. McGuire Jr. flew lead, his aircraft glinting with the paint-worn scars of 100 missions. He was already a legend, America's second-highest scoring ace, the quiet, analytical pilot who wrote the very tactics manual 5th Air Force pilots lived by. But this morning, something else drove him. Not doctrine, not orders. A number, 40. Dick Bong's record. 2 victories ahead of him. McGuire had 38. General Kinney had grounded him weeks earlier, hoping to preserve one of America's deadliest aces. McGuire ignored it. He'd flown too long, survived too much, to stop when he was this close. The Philippines campaign was nearing its decisive phase. Japanese air resistance was thinning. A pilot could fly a dozen missions and never see an enemy fighter. But McGuire knew the patterns. Knew the valleys the Japanese used as transit corridors. Knew where an instructor pilot might take a trainee for dawn practice flights. And so he led 3 wingmen southwest, descending to 3,000 feet, exactly where he once told younger pilots never to initiate combat with external tanks attached. The drop tanks should have been jettisoned the moment a potential threat appeared. It was rule number 1 in the manual he had written, yet McGuire held them. Perhaps he believed the encounter would unfold as so many others had: spot, dive, fire, climb away. No turning fight, no prolonged engagement. Just one clean burst at an enemy who never saw him coming. But Negro's was quiet, too quiet, until a dark speck lifted sharply off the tree line. A single key, 43 Oscar, climbing with surprising aggression. McGuire watched it rise, watched it bank toward the formation with a confidence that suggested hours, not minutes, of experience in this airspace. Whatever instinct guided him in that moment, it wasn't the manual. McGuire tightened his formation and kept the drop tanks on. For P-38s versus 1 Oscar, it should have been simple. It wouldn't be. The key, 43, closed the distance with startling speed, its engine note rising as it climbed into the sun. McGuire expected hesitation, a brief moment where the Japanese pilot assessed the odds and broke away. Instead, the Oscar rolled inverted and dove straight at the P-38 formation, as if attacking 4 Lightnings alone were routine. That confidence revealed something important. This was no trainee, no fresh replacement pilot. This was a seasoned flyer who knew precisely what he was doing. Warrant Officer Akira Sugimoto had more than 3,000 hours in Key 43s. He had trained new pilots, flown escort missions, survived the attrition of the entire Pacific campaign. And he understood the Oscar's strengths at low altitude. Instantaneous roll response, tight turning radius, the ability to pivot almost weightlessly around a single wingtip. Against a clean P-38, it was still a challenge. Against a P-38 carrying 1,000 pounds of fuel and drag on its wings, the imbalance became lethal. McGuire dipped his nose and accelerated, expecting his flight to follow. He had always insisted on strict formation discipline, and his pilots trusted him. None questioned why the tank stayed on. None reminded him of the manual. They simply followed the commanding officer who had led them through months of combat, the man whose tactical instincts were considered near infallible. Sugimoto dove through the formation, breaking apart the tight foreship and forcing McGuire to turn hard. Far harder than a loaded P-38 should at this altitude. The moment he hauled on the stick, the Lightning protested. The airframe shuddered as the drop tanks bit into the airflow, pulling at the wings like anchors. The manual warned explicitly about this. At low speed and heavy weight, the P-38's stall margins shrank to almost nothing. But McGuire wasn't thinking about stall margins. He was thinking about lead pursuit angles, closure rate, gun harmonization. He saw an opportunity. Sugimoto briefly overshooting, momentarily vulnerable. A perfect firing window if he could tighten the turn just a few degrees more. His wingmen saw the danger before he did. Captain Edwin Weaver called out, voice sharp through the intercom, warning that the turn was too tight, too slow, too low. At 300 feet, there was no space to recover from anything, no altitude to trade for airspeed, no margin for error. McGuire didn't respond. The Oscar arced gracefully ahead, its pilot already setting up for the next maneuver. And McGuire, chasing those last two victories, hauled back on the controls just a little more. Physics answered immediately. At 300 feet, the P-38 reached its limit. No warning horn, no time for correction, just the sudden, brutal certainty of physics reclaiming control. The left wing dropped first, a sharp, snapping motion, the kind every pilot dreads, the kind that happens when lift simply disappears. McGuire felt the aircraft roll past the point of recovery in a single heartbeat, the Lightning lurching inverted as the overloaded wings stalled simultaneously. The P-38 flipped onto its back so violently that his wingmen gasped aloud. Weaver shouted for him to release the tanks, but it was already too late. The drag of the fuel pods forced the wing past its critical angle, pulling the Lightning into a catastrophic, unrecoverable roll. McGuire's instincts, those that had saved him dozens of times, reacted instantly. Power forward, rudder correction, aileron input, all automatic, all useless. The Lightning was no longer flying. It was falling. Sugimoto saw it happen. Even from the Oscar's cockpit, he recognized the unmistakable silhouette of a stall spin sequence. But he didn't chase the crippled P-38. He knew better. A falling Lightning could become debris in seconds, but a second P-38 still had the energy and altitude to fight. Sugimoto broke away, preparing for the next threat as McGuire's aircraft rolled beneath him. Inside the P-38, the world blurred. The sky inverted. The ground spiraled up in a brown-green smear. McGuire fought the controls with everything he had, but an inverted stall at 300 feet offered no forgiveness. There was no altitude to trade, no remaining momentum to convert, no hidden trick in the manual he himself had written. Weaver watched helplessly from above, tracing the arc of the falling Lightning. He would later describe it as a clean, smooth, terrible motion, as if the aircraft were not crashing but being pulled downward by some invisible hand. The P-38 rolled through a final half-turn, nose down, canopy flashing once in the morning sun. It hit the ground less than 2 seconds later. The impact was a white-orange burst of dust and fragments, the explosion absorbed instantly by the dense vegetation. No fideval, no towering column of smoke, just a violent jolt of earth rising and settling again, and then silence. The squadron circled once, stunned. McGuire, their commander, their tactician, their calm, methodical ace, was gone. Not in a drawn-out dogfight, not high altitude, not against impossible odds, but in a low-speed turn where 1,000 pounds of fuel, one moment of fixation, and one violation of his own doctrine erased all escape. Sugimoto climbed away, unaware that he had just taken down America's second-highest scoring ace without firing a shot. For several seconds after the crash, the radio fell silent. No commands, no breathing, no one willing to speak the truth, already settling over the formation like a physical weight. They continued circling, searching the jungle canopy for a sign, movement, wreckage, anything, but the impact point was swallowed instantly by trees and undergrowth. Weaver's voice finally cracked through the static, thin and unsteady. I've lost visual. I think the major's down. Each pilot knew what that meant. At 300 feet, a stall was a death sentence. The P-38 was a magnificent fighter, fast and lethal, but it demanded respect. Loaded with external tanks in a turn, it punished even the smallest miscalculation. And McGuire, the man who had taught them all this, had ignored the very rules that kept them alive. Sugimoto had already vanished into the haze, his key, 43, climbing toward the northern ridges. In any other circumstance, the 4 P-38s would have pursued him, eager to finish the fight. But now Weaver's flight felt unmoored, as if the loss of their commander had shifted the air itself. They reformed tighter and more cautious, each man processing the same shock in silence. Weaver called it, "We're heading home." It wasn't retreat. It was instinct. An understanding that nothing good came from pilots flying in shock. They rose through broken clouds, leaving behind the valley where McGuire had fallen. As the coastline emerged beneath them, the full contradiction of the morning pressed in. They had lost the man who shaped their tactics, the quiet figure whose skill had seemed almost mathematical, immune to error. And yet, this error was as human as any ever made in combat, a moment where ambition outpaced caution. Back at Dulag Airfield, the squadron's ground crew knew something was wrong the moment the fighters taxied in. McGuire's parking slot remained empty, dust blowing across the metal planking. Mechanics glanced toward the open space, then toward Weaver, who stepped down from his cockpit without removing his helmet. His eyes said everything. The squadron gathered, words spreading faster than the official report. Men who had flown with McGuire through New Guinea, Biak, Leyte, all understood the weight of the loss. You could replace aircraft. You could replace engines. You could even replace a squadron's roster. But you couldn't replace a pilot who combined mathematics, intuition, and patience so precisely that others reshaped their flying just to match it. And now they had to explain how the man who wrote the rulebook had died breaking it. The official report was written quickly, too quickly for the men who had been there. It noted the essential facts. Engagement with a Japanese fighter, loss of control at low altitude, crash due to stall. Clean, clinical, stripped of the tension, the hesitation, the split-second decisions that framed the moment. But 5th Air Force Headquarters knew this was no ordinary loss. McGuire wasn't just another pilot. He was a symbol, an ace whose presence steadied younger flyers, whose calm lectures on energy management and engagement angles had become doctrine across the Pacific. General George Kenney read the report twice, jaw tightening. He had grounded McGuire for a reason, an instinct born not of doubt, but of experience. Too many aces had died chasing one more kill, one more confirmation, one more statistic that mattered far less than their survival. But grounding orders were paper wings in a war built on momentum and necessity. McGuire had slipped into the air anyway. Kenney summoned the operations staff. His question was blunt. Why didn't he drop the tanks? No one had an answer. They pulled up McGuire's own manual, the one distributed to every P-38 squadron in 5th Air Force. The text was unambiguous. Never engage in a turning fight with external loads attached. Immediate jettison upon threat detection. He had written those words himself. The contradiction was unbearable. Kenney knew pilots would talk. News always traveled through airfields faster than any memo. Mechanics would whisper that even ace pilots were not immune to fatal mistakes. Junior flyers would wonder whether doctrine mattered, if even its author ignored it. What the Air Force needed wasn't silence. It needed clarity. Within 48 hours, a new standing order was drafted. Not a recommendation, not a guideline, a command. External fuel tanks will be jettisoned immediately upon sighting an enemy fighter. No exceptions. Every squadron received it the same day. Every pilot signed acknowledgement. The language left no room for interpretation. It was the rare instance where policy changed not because a committee studied data, but because one man's final seconds had demonstrated with devastating clarity why the rule existed. Yet among McGuire's squadron, the order carried a heavier weight. It felt personal, almost like a memorial carved into procedure. They knew it wasn't about assigning blame. Kenney admired McGuire deeply, but the lesson was now etched into the Air Force's bloodstream. Doctrine is not optional. Physics does not negotiate. Altitude is life, and obsession, even for the most skilled among them, could kill faster than any enemy round. In the days that followed, the men of the 431st Fighter Squadron moved with a muted heaviness, their routines unchanged, but their mood distinctly altered. McGuire had never been the loudest or most charismatic presence on the flight line. He was methodical, quiet, analytical, an ace who flew like a mathematician solving problems at 400 miles per hour. And perhaps because of that discipline, his loss felt impossible. If he could be taken by a low-speed stall, what hope did the rest of them have? Pilots gathered in small groups under the winged shadows of their lightnings, replaying the brief, violent engagement in broken fragments. They didn't criticize him, no one dared, but they analyzed the moments leading up to the stall the way McGuire himself would have encouraged. The extra drag of the tanks, the low airspeed of the tightening turn, the deceptive confidence of Sugimoto's maneuver. Each detail formed a chain, each link unremarkable on its own, but catastrophic when joined. Some blamed ambition, others blamed instinct, but most simply recognized the truth every pilot feared. Even the best could misread the sky. News rippled through other squadrons just as quickly. Ace pilots across the theater felt a jolt of recognition. Too many of them had taken risks in search of confirmation kills. Some had chased damaged aircraft too low, others had turned too hard while fuel tanks were still attached. But those situations had ended in lucky recoveries, hurried climbs, or narrow escapes. McGuire's accident stripped away the illusion that skill alone could outrun consequence. Maintenance crews took it hardest. They had revered McGuire not for his record, but for his precision. He listened to their concerns, respected their inspections, and spoke to them like equals. Now, they worked quietly, checking stall warning systems twice, inspecting fuel tank release mechanisms with meticulous care. Every action had an undercurrent of grief. At the officer's mess, McGuire's empty seat was left untouched. His maps, still marked with hand-drawn altitude notes and intercept diagrams, remained where he had left them the morning of the flight. No one moved them. It felt wrong to erase the last traces of his methodical presence. And yet, even amid the mourning, there was no bitterness toward the order Kinney issued. If anything, the squadron embraced it. They understood better than anyone that McGuire's final act had reshaped the rules not out of punishment, but to keep every pilot who followed from making the same fatal sequence of choices. The sky would not change for them, but they could change how they entered it. The crash site was found 2 days later by a Filipino guerrilla patrol moving through the dense jungle north of La Carlota. The vegetation had swallowed most of the wreckage, as if the earth itself had tried to hide the violence of the impact. The P-38's fuselage was compressed into the soil, wings severed, the tail section twisted into a shape unrecognizable to anyone who had flown the aircraft. There was no fire, just torn metal, shattered aluminum, and the unmistakable signature of a stall-driven crash at extreme low altitude. The guerrillas recovered McGuire's identification materials and passed them to U.S. ground forces, who relayed the confirmation back to the 431st. The reality that everyone had already known now became official. The man whose flying style was defined by restraint had died in the only kind of fight he had always avoided: slow, low, and encumbered. When word reached the squadron, reactions varied. Some pilots stared at the ground, quietly absorbing the finality. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A few simply walked away, unable to reconcile the mathematics of the event with the man they knew. Weaver, the last pilot to see McGuire alive, remained silent for hours. He replayed the stall repeatedly in his mind. The angle, the altitude, the roll, the brief moment when the aircraft hesitated before dropping through the air. He wondered if a single extra second, a slightly different input, or a jettison tank might have altered everything. But the truth was brutally simple. At 300 feet, there are no second chances. The squadron held a small ceremony on the flight line that evening. No ceremony could be elaborate, not in the conditions of a forward airstrip carved from mud and pierced steel planking, but they gathered at sunset, engines silent, windsock barely stirring. A chaplain read brief words. The squadron commander, eyes red but voice steady, spoke not of McGuire's record, but of his discipline, his calm, and the way younger pilots had flown with more confidence simply by knowing he was in the sky with them. As the sun dipped below the horizon, for P-38s took off and flew a slow formation pass. One aircraft pulled sharply upward. The missing man maneuver, its silhouette rising into the amber sky before banking away. The pattern was simple and somber, but every pilot who watched felt the same tightening in their chest. McGuire had been the steady center of their tactical world. Now that center was gone. But even in loss, something remained. A lesson, a mandate, a reminder that no amount of experience, rank, or ambition could rewrite the physics of flight. And that perhaps was the legacy McGuire never intended to leave but did.